War 116 was one of the shortest wars Foxhole has had in the last year and a half, lasting only 15.4 days. At the start of the war, the Colonials launched a devastating series of offensive attacks, which resulted in a swift capture of critical territory. This ultimately led to a decisive Colonial victory. With limited resistance from the Wardens and the rapid pace of combat, this war stands as a stark contrast to many of the game's lengthier, bloodier wars. Today I will cover every day of the war and what made this war so one-sided. The war start was different from the typical North versus South wars we normally have. Every now and then the devs like to mix it up with the starting locations. For War 116, we had the Wardens starting off in the northeast corner, and the Colonials starting in the southwest corner. Within the first 24 hours of the war, the Colonials had started off with a bang. Down in the southwest corner, the Colonials dashed out of the gate and took Ashfields and all of Origin. Regiments UA and NEP were leading the charge. These two regiments rushed for Steel Road, a North Territory in Origin. Taking Steel Road would cut off any Warden Logi from entering Origin. Once Steel Road was secure, all the Colonials had to do was starve out the southern Origin Warden towns. They were getting all of this done with nothing but rifles and grenades, as it was still only the first day of the war and nothing had been researched yet. It was one of the best non-vehicle pushes we had seen in a long time. A similar Colonial assault took place in Marbin Hollow. The Colonials were once again able to take a northern territory to cut off any Logi supplies, and the last Colonial attack took place in the Deadlands. All of the Deadlands was taken but the Salt March, but this territory would eventually be lost the next day to lack of Logi supplies. The Wardens were not losing every front on the first day though. A regiment called the 38th had managed to take all of Clan's Head from the Colonials, ensuring at least one victory for the day. On day 2 of the war, the Colonials were pushing fast into Stableport and towards the refinery town of Cinderwick. T3C, a Colonial regiment, brought up supplies from Ashfields to keep this fight going. They brought up thousands of crates throughout the day. This would ultimately help the Colonials capture Cinderwick and all of Stableport. During the Stableport battle, 2 regiments called Shred and Steel would push from the south into King's Cage to secure the southern territories. Over on the east side of the map, the regiment UBGE was building a base just east of Weathering Hall. UBGE had taken out the seaport, cutting off supplies to the Wardens. This would eventually lead to the Colonials capturing all of Weathered Expanse. After initially losing the starting territories in the east of Clan's Head region, the Colonials were able to mount up a counterattack and very swiftly take control of the whole region, while another small group came up from Viper's Pit to occupy the area south of the river. One Warden in Clan's Head reported that not enough defenses were built on the original captured territory. After losing all of Clan's Head, more Warden builders rallied around Howell County and built up some serious defenses to stop the Colonial force from advancing any further. On day 3, Viper's Pit was heavily under attack. The 1st Colonial Marine Division, a Colonial regiment, had built a base near Blackthroat. They then proceeded to mammon rush Blackthroat for hours until it was destroyed. The Wardens had tried to counter these Colonials with 4 field machine guns, but unfortunately for the Wardens, 1 CMD had flanked around the entire map and had decrewed all 4 field guns, and were even able to steal them and take them back to their base. By taking Blackthroat, this left the Warden's capital town of Kirkel vulnerable. Close by to the north, the Colonials moved into Howell County from Clan's Head. The Colonials were able to secure Sickle Shile right away with little resistance, one player reports. Little Lamb just down the road was a much harder fight for the Colonials. Within the span of 2 days, the Colonials had pushed through multiple hexes and were not letting up. This was one of the most offensive starts we had seen from either faction in a long time. Think about how in the previous war, the territories were at a stalemate for almost 25 days. Early on day 4, the Colonials had taken Serenity's Blight to the north of Kirknell and had surrounded any Wardens left in the hex. Kirknell would be one of the biggest urban fights of the war. Because it was only day 4 of the war, both sides were still battling one another with nothing but rifles. This made urban fighting that much more exciting. Many players report this as one of the best battles of the war. Eventually though, Kirknell would be captured and all of Viper's Pit would belong to the Colonials. Once the seaport was up for the Colonials in Kirknell, the regiment T3C would supply this front the rest of the war with anything the Colonials needed. They called these large supply runs Costco runs. Towards the middle of the map in the Linn of the Mercy, Colonials had pushed in on the southeast side of the region. Though this did nothing to help capture the Linn of Mercy region, it was one of the reasons the Colonials were able to get into Callahan's Passage. The regiment Superlogi was able to sneak past a few defenses in Callahan's Passage, and they secured Skaith Passage. Taking this territory helped the Colonials push into the south side very quickly. We started day 5 off with a bang. 120mm artillery had been researched for the Wardens first. The Colonials would have their own 120mm guns later in the day. Because the Wardens were able to get their artillery guns online first, the Wardens had been able to push the Colonials out of Howell County and back into Clan's Head. One player reports that they were able to set up 3 artillery guns in Howell County just in time. Their artillery guns had held back 3 tankettes and a horde of Colonial infantry. This ended up saving their concrete bases. A regiment that helped with this battle was called Knight. The player also reported that this was one of the best examples they had seen, with regiments fighting alongside random players on the battlefield. While the battles on the mainland were moving forward, a group of colonials that were mainly newer players in low ranks successfully organized a naval invasion into Ursa Base into Godscroft. Over a dozen barges with Logi vehicles, APCs, and 5 gunboats were used for this invasion. One player reports there being a few hiccups with the plan, but that was to be expected with their lack of experience. Though they didn't achieve full control of Isawa, they were still proud that they were able to clear out Ursa and give the Wardens a good scare. Back in Viper's Pit, a Warden force attempted to take Kirkel back. This was one player's account from that battle. The player reported that the fields west of Kirkel had little defenses, only a few trenches and some barbed wire. This left the city quite vulnerable to attacks from the west. The Wardens would throw infantry and armored vehicles at Kirkel for 3 hours straight. Slowly, they would make their way up to the city walls. But once they reached the city walls, they had noticed that the Colonials had the high ground above them. The Colonials were able to keep the Wardens back for about 2 hours throughout this gunfire exchange, but eventually the Wardens would breach the city walls. A few regiments on the Colonials side, Waifu, 1 CMD, 141st, 69th, and CIR, would reinforce Kirkel with tankettes. The tankettes and some half-tracks continued back and forth between the 2 choke points into the city, denying the Wardens entrance for over 4 hours. After a while, some Warden scout tanks had arrived and had started pushing the southwest road. The player reports that the streets then became a massive graveyard of thousands of bodies from both the Wardens and the Colonial side. And then during the night, artillery cannons from the Wardens began to rain shells down on Kirkel, pushing the Colonials back deeper into the city. The Colonials were eventually able to add some artillery to their ranks as well. They used pallet after pallet of shells to try and keep the Wardens from advancing any further into the city. Colonial artillery had successfully pushed the Wardens back far enough to give the Colonials in the middle of the city a bit of a break. During this break in the battle, the Colonials had reinforced their defenses within the city, laying tank mines and barbed wire wherever they could. These defenses forced the Wardens into small choke points, making their attack more difficult. More regiments showed up to the battle like HM, Simp, Air, Somme, and Red V. The defenses had eventually pushed the Wardens out of the city. Just when the Colonials had thought they had saved the city, more artillery had joined the Warden side. Shells destroyed all of their progress, and the shells were even targeting the seaport, which was the lifeblood for the Colonials. The seaport would go down 3 times during the last stand of the town hall. The Wardens moved in their troops and vehicles to surround the town hall in Kirkel. This standoff would last several hours, but eventually the Colonials would push out again. The Wardens wouldn't leave the city without a fight, though. It took the Colonials 45 minutes to push them out of the city. A group of WLL members and armored cars had cut off the Warden Logi as well, which made it hard for the Wardens to keep fighting. The entire assault of Kirkel lasted 14 hours. The final report from the players said that this was one of the best battles they had seen from both factions in a long time. GG's to both sides. The battle for Kirkel in War 116 will not be forgotten. I should note at this time that not much had happened over the last couple of days in the southwest corner of the map in Westgate and King's Cage. At least nothing players wanted to report to me. I played a few times in Westgate this war and it was just a constant back and forth slugfest. Crazy fronts this war were happening in the northeast. With the Colonials swiftly kicked out of Howell County, on day 6 the Wardens had started to siege the king. The Colonials didn't have artillery guns set up in Clan's Head at this time, and because of this they were barely holding on. A Colonial Logi player reported that trying to supply regions like Howell County and Viper's Pit was not easy because there was no storage depot or refineries nearby. This made Logi runs extremely long. The Colonials were truly suffering from success. A big push finally happened in Westgate. The Colonials had pushed from King's Cage and Stableport and took territories in the middle of the Hex. This cut off all Logi to the southern territories. The Colonials eventually starved them out and finally had a good foothold in Westgate. On the 7th day of the war, the Wardens had finally broken the king in Clan's Head Valley, and had pushed the Colonials back to Fort Esterwild in Clan's Head. This was a great victory for the Wardens and one that they desperately needed. During this time, the Wardens had also tried to take some territory in Lockmore as well. One Colonial player reported that a group of players stopped almost 20 Warden Logi trucks in Lockmore along Market Road. This partisan work kept the Wardens from advancing into the west side of Lockmore. The players had spent hours making sure the Wardens couldn't hold any ground. For the first time all war on day 8 and 9, we saw fairly stable fronts. A lot of territories were just going back and forth between both factions. On day 10, the light tanks for both sides had been researched and started coming onto the battlefield. One Colonial player reported a massive light tank operation that moved across King's Cage all the way over to Westgate, helping secure Westgate for the Colonials once again. Starting on this day, Lockmore would not see any territory exchanged. The battle would remain at the bridge between Tomb of the First and Mercy's Wish. This would last the remaining 6 days of the war. Back on the northeast side of the map, the Colonials had once again pushed the Wardens out of Clan's Head Valley. and were making their way into Howell County. During day 11, the Wardens lost all of Howell County. I heard reports from Wardens that on the south side of the Hex not enough defenses were built up, which made it easy for the Colonials to take the Hex. I also heard several reports that players had a great time battling over the Great Warden Dam. The battle apparently lasted between 12 to 14 hours. While this battle was going on, a group of Colonials were making their way into Hungry Wolf to push the Wardens out of the Hex for good. On day 12 of the war, the Colonials had breached Basin. Basin was home to a big logistics hub for the Wardens. The Wardens had started to unload their giant stockpiles of tanks and were able to push the Colonials back out of the Hex rather quickly. I was near the south side of Basin one night when 6 Warden light tanks rushed our bunker base. We had luckily defended ourselves from that attack, but the Wardens would continue to throw everything they had at us. All other fronts on the west side of the map remained stable. The 13th day of the war saw major battles in Callahan's Passage and in Reaching Trail. The Wardens had attempted to push the Colonials out, but unfortunately for the Wardens, the Colonials held their ground. A Navy invasion once again occurred in Godscroft on the 14th day. I think this is the only island Hex that saw any sort of action the entire war. While we were marching towards Basin, a group of Colonials called the 113th had invaded Godscroft, an island region to the east of us. Their invasion started in Fleece Watch with 10 tanks and 2 CVs and a crane to unload the iron ships. Fleece Watch went down quickly for the Wardens and the relic was quickly rebuilt. After building up supplies and small defenses, the Colonials moved across Isawa. The Wardens put up a tough fight on the bridges, but unfortunately the Wardens would lose this island territory due to lack of Logi access. Nicely done to the 113th and anyone else who joined this fight. During this invasion, the Colonials made their way into Basin and took the logistical town of Cuttail Station. The Colonials only needed one more victory point to win this war. On the 15th and final day of the war, the Colonials set their sights on Tyne and Speaking Woods to be their last victory point. The battle for Tyne lasted over 10 hours. From the reports that players sent me about this battle, it sounded like everyone had a lot of fun. The Wardens had managed to bring in a couple frigates up the waterway to keep the Colonials from building the town hall several times. The MMVC regiment used their frigate to blow up the Colonial bunker bases on the east side of the Hex. Other Warden regiments like Ashon and Spud would also bring a frigate to the battle at different parts of the battle to keep the Colonials back from ending the war. Somme on the Colonial side had commanded tank lines in the Hex for 5 straight hours, taking out the concrete bases that led to Tyne. The Colonials had what seemed like an endless supply of anti-tank gear to help protect the construction vehicle building the town hall. With the town hall rebuilt for the 4th or 5th time, the Colonials would finally defend it and the war would be over. War 116 was 15.4 days long and had 2,611,483 casualties. GG's to the Colonials for your second win in a row. We all know what the elephant in the room was this war. The Warden population was not quite there, and with low population and a devastating war start, we all kinda knew this war would be shorter. I've stated many times that I don't like to call any war a break war, because there are players out there still giving it their all and doing their best to keep their faction alive, and I don't want to make their efforts seem meaningless. But if I were to ever call any war a break war, I would say any war that lasts under 20 days could be labeled as a break war, at least compared to the kind of wars that we normally have. For any new players out there, this length of war is not normal. You can go over to Foxhole stats and see the length of all the wars and see that this was an outlier. GG's to everyone that played in War 116. Now let's make War 117 the forever war. If I didn't mention any major battles or operations that happened throughout this war, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you would like to add your stories or your regiment stories for the next war recap, join my Discord. The link is in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching and for your support. Make sure to subscribe for more Foxhole content. I'll see you out on the battlefield. Cheers.